Hello, and this is part two of our lecture on looking at the three sectors and looking at comparing their organization, administration, and finance. So last lecture, we spoke a lot about the private sector, how businesses get started, what you need to start a company. You need capital needs, how you fulfill these capital needs. For example, you have to have debt and equity, looking at what happens if you're a private public organization, with shares and that sort of thing. And we also spoke with some of the challenges then of having to make a profit. We also spoke about the not-for-profit sector, looking at specifically, how they're organized, and we looked at their how they generate revenue and some of the specific challenges. We last ended looking at fundraising, for generating revenue, looking at donor cultivation. So we talked about donor cultivation is the term to describe the relationship building. And donor base is the people in the community who are your regular contributors, the people you count on. So the goal is about making friends with the donor, because donors give to their friends, not to organizations. We have to look at the donation exchange. Funding sources for not-for-profit organizations are voluntary. And donation exchange is different from value exchange in business or taxation exchange in government. Donation exchange is unique to the financial management of not-for-profit organizations. So value exchange is when people trade their money for a product or service that has value. You purchase something or pay for a service, and maybe you might think it's expensive sometimes, but you've obviously thought it had value. In government, relies on taxation exchange. People pay taxes to governments, and in return, they receive services that they may or may not use, or may have to pay a small additional fee to use. The donation exchange, though, is that people give money and only receive a good feeling in return. Donating makes donors feel good. Donors want to make the world a better place. It's about altruism. Donors recognize that their donations are important to the contribution of the continuation of the organization. So what happens then when a not-for-profit organization makes money? Well, they make a profit. They're not allowed to. Well, they can spend the money on hiring additional staff, for example, growing it a bit. They can make capital improvements like renovations to a building or purchasing of a new building or land or equipment. They can also vacate their not-for-profit status. There are not-for-profit companies, organizations that ended up becoming for-profit. This was in the book. I guess they can sit on the money until Canada Revenue catches them. But, and that does happen. People get caught. Another issue with not-for-profit organizations is the development of directors. The person, you have a board of directors, and in particular, you have an executive director. So they're not called a manager or director, they're called executive director. And they really need to manage these revenue engines. They have to manage staff, and they answer to the board of directors. The board of directors is required to be chartered as a not-for-profit organization. You have to list your board of directors. There could be large or small. There's often different rules about, for different organizations who sits on their board. There's what's called a working board of directors and a non-working board of directors. A working board of directors also works in the organization. That's usually for small small not-for-profit. And generally, you need at least an executive director, a secretary, and a treasurer. a minimum are the 3 requirements. And that's called the executive. Then after that, you have the board of directors, who are other people. They have to meet on a regular basis. It's in the policies. It's usually 4 times a year. They have to maintain minutes of the meetings, and they have to be prepared to, share them with government. They have to maintain at least 3 members. And usually it's 10. You have to have more than 10 for fundraising purposes. And they're appointed to the board by the board itself. So that's another issue. You've got to deal with all of that about a board of directors. So that is some of the, how organization, administration, and the finance works in the not-for-profit sector. We're now going to move on to the government sector, or the public sector. The government sector is more public. You're in the public eye. You have to then understand how national, provincial, and local governments function financially, which is important. You need to understand that managing money is public. The public sector leisure services is different from that of private and not-for-profit sectors. It has different accounting systems and different level of transparency. So when we look at federalism, or federalism is the federal principle or system of government at the national level. It's a system of government in which power is divided between a central authority and constituent political units. And there's 2 different types of federalism. These are terms that are used in political science. There's layer cake federalism and marble cake federalism. And literally, like the vision, the image here is just what they say about cakes. You've got a layer cake. You first have your vanilla layer. Then is your chocolate layer. Then is maybe a peanut butter layer. That sounds good. And where a marble cake is the mixing, you've got chocolate and vanilla, together, marbling. Could have 3 flavors or more even. So it's just like a cake. So in layer cake federalism, it's layers. There's distinct separation of power between federal, provincial, and municipal government. The national government provides some services, the province provides others, and the local unit provides, others. Think of like athletics or instructional programs. The federal government provides none of these programs. They provide agencies. They provide recreation areas to host activities. And even the province doesn't provide programs. It really only provides facilities. So most of recreation and leisure, active recreation programs is left to at the local level. In contrast, marble cake federalism is a mixing or overlap of the powers of federal, provincial, and municipal governments. For example, parks is a good example of a marble cake kind of system. Providing public parks is really a blend of all 3 governments. We have our national parks, we have provincial parks, and we have municipal and even neighborhood parks. And actually, they're often in competition with each other. So in terms of, looking, let's say, at parks, layer cake would argue that there are national parks that provide completely different services than those provided by state and local park systems. Where the marble cake approach would argue that there's national parks that provide services that are similar to those provided by state and local park systems. And you can think of healthcare. Healthcare has another, you could look at most of it's a layer cake type of system. So the government sector financial management is different. You have the federal level, you have provincial, and you have municipal different structures. So federal level accounting is all about what's called the appropriation budget. The focus is on spending money, not raising money. An appropriation budget is the fact that the appropriations are budgeted amounts of money that the government unit intends to spend. So the national government operates on a cash basis. So, people get all together and, develop a budget, the appropriation budget. And then later, if they spend too much money or run out of revenue, they borrow money, or the federal government also might print more money. So the budgeting is different at the federal level. Departments submit expenditure requests. So like, how much do they think they're actually going to spend? Then the government passes appropriation laws to permit the departments to spend that money. So they have to pass the budget. That's what the whole budget passing thing is. They do every year. There's actually virtually no matching of revenues to expenditures. And where there are budget shortfalls, the national government borrows money from its own treasury. So I don't quite understand this, but it also is what I do understand. It sounds scary to me. Basically, the federal government doesn't have to ever break even or ever try to match their expenditures with revenues. In contrast, at the provincial level, there might be some borrowing of money to augment revenue shortfalls, but mostly they are trying to spend every penny of their line items so that budgets won't get reduced the following year. The revenues rarely matched with expenditures either. They can some operate more on a cash basis. And there's evidence of pervasive politics, which are called iron triangles. These are interest groups. So iron triangles are permanent alliances among three groups: interest groups, elected officials, and bureaucrats, and they can be very strong. Now, obviously, this is stronger at in the states because of the fact that corporations can donate money to political parties, where there are only we don't lobby groups and or corporate. There's not allowed corporate sponsors in politics in Canada. So there's also differences in states or provinces and the national government. States can't create money. They can't deficit spend for a long time. And also the national government does dictate to them. They often try to tell provinces, what to do. Also, a state or province, same word, it have actual political cultures. You can certainly think of that in the US. You think of Texas has a certain political culture versus, let's say California. You can think about it if they're, left or right. So political cultures of states, and we can think of this, in Canada as well. We could look at the provinces and divide them as being traditionalistic, moralistic, or individualistic. So traditional cultures usually tend to entrench the influence of existing interest groups. So where the values, beliefs, and traditions of the state are such that it is important to continue the status quo, meaning they follow traditions, they have traditional values, traditional beliefs, traditional cultures, and don't want change. You may think more of, the southern states, for example, typically have traditionalistic cultures. Then there's moralistic cultures, government cultures. So these are when cultures of states that tend to minimize the influence of interest groups. It's more about being morals. They have values and beliefs and traditions are such that it is important to act on behalf of the general welfare of the populace. So it's a lot about ethics. Then we have individualistic cultures. These are cultures of states that tend to accommodate interest groups, where the values, beliefs, and traditions are such that is every man for himself, and it would be irrational for anyone to act otherwise. So, Texas would be an example of that. And in Canada, I'm not exactly sure how I would classify all of our provinces. But Newfoundland, I would view as more of a traditionalistic culture. It's more rooted in deep tradition. No, that doesn't mean change isn't happening or there are differences, but, we're our province is certainly viewed more as, having, more traditional values. Individualistic province might be, for example, Alberta. And moralistic. I could make a joke here. Is there a moralistic government? I'm not sure. But anyway, you might think of some. British Columbia seems quite a little more moralistic. I'm not sure, but I would say so. So the political system or political culture of a province or state can affect leisure services. The traditional state cultures believe that leisure services are outside of the scope of government. Why should government pay for that sort of stuff? The moralistic state cultures believe that leisure services are essential, that it's part of public interest. Now I would say in Canada, we do follow that more. The individualistic state cultures would believe that the local government should pay for the services they want. So they would put more of that at the local level of government, not provincially. So when provinces are in poor financial status, they're forced to cut back on expenditures. And what's one of the first places they cut? Well, recreation and leisure. And, if you really look at it, a lot of provincial funding for parks and recreation or even local hasn't really gone up even since the 80s. Maybe I think we've had a lot of infrastructure being built, but not operating expenses, budget. And a lot of this has to do with the public choice political model. What is that? Public choice is a political science term that describes the belief that governments should only provide public safety services, like essential services, and they should not provide other so-called non-essential services such as parks and recreation. So when it comes down to it, parks and recreation gets cut, which is really silly because it mostly influences the rest of all things that are important. So at the provincial level, their financing is often viewed what's called general funds. General funds are groups of accounts. They're usually segregated by the different departments, like, for example, the Department of Health, the Department of Education, Department of Family Services and Welfare. And actually, sorry, I'm probably getting all them wrong, what they're called in Newfoundland right now. They change the department names constantly based on who's, how they restructure things depending on who's in power. So, and usually, obviously, certain departments receive more funding. And some of this funding comes from a multitude of revenue sources. If revenue sources are not dedicated to leisure services by law, then the government can spend the general fund as they see fit, whereas departments, compete then for budget requests. So in government and at the province, every department is trying to put in what they need for their budget, and basically all the different departments are competing against each other. Same with at the university. Each of the faculties and schools, you're competing. There's usually a dedicated tax source at the provincial level. So this is property, sales, or other taxes that can only be spent for a sole purpose, such as park and recreation services. For example, there's usually like a certain portion of tax that might be dedicated to the provincial park system. Now, at the municipal level, leisure service providers at the local level of government really exist in two different forms. There's usually like a subunit of a general purpose government, for example, like parks and recreation departments of municipalities, or they could be outside of the municipal, kind of like the direct government, and be like more direct providers of services, for example, parks and conservation. At the local level, we also have to consider how tax revenue laws differ. There are two different types of revenue laws. One's called the Home Rule and one's called Dillons Rule. On the next slide, I'll go through what these mean. But basically, Dillons Rule, if you're a parent, would be, let's say I'm a parent and I'm going away. And this is, if I followed Dillons Rule, I would say to my children, call us every night and don't do anything that we don't approve first. So kind of like a controlling, right? Where the Home Rule would be me as a parent telling my kids, use your own judgment, but don't have any parties. You don't have to come to me for everything. But I'm going to give certain rules about how you can actually spend this money. So Dillons Rule, again, that is local government can only levy what taxes the province permits and nothing else. So the local government has, in Dillons Rule, they only have the powers that the province specifically permits them. In contrast, the Home Rule, the local government can decide how they want to use the taxes, depending on community needs. They they can do what they want except for like following, there's obviously going to be specific guidelines of what you can do or not do with money. And if you look in the textbook, it goes on about this, of course, more from an American perspective. But tax revenue in Canada, we are predominantly ruled by Dillons Rule. So that means that most of our provincial governments control most of how the local municipal government can spend taxes. It's not based on community need. It's very much a top-down approach. So municipal governments then are only allowed to exercise powers that are explicitly granted to them by provincial legislation. And by the way, this the principle is referred to as Dillons Rule. It came from in Iowa, a judge named John Dillon. That's why it's called that. But over the years, Dillons Rule has become the cornerstone of both American and Canadian municipal law. But it's starting to change. In the U.S., almost as soon as Dillons Rule became established, Americans began looking to, how to get around it. To empower their cities, state governments amended their constitutions and enacted legislation. So in the U.S., there's a lot of variation, but only 6 American states still operate strictly by Dillons Rule alone. Whereas in Canada, Dillons Rule still dominates, but reform is starting. So it's a good thing. Like we want, ideally, it'd be better to have the Home Rule because local government could have more control. The first significant shift towards the Home Rule was in Canada in 1994 when Alberta overhauled its Municipal Government Act. Alberta's been a leader on this, and they have granted now a lot more power to municipal governments. Also in 1998, Nova Scotia developed this. And, I'm not sure if there's other provinces who have also changed to the Home Rule. So that was then about the government sector. And obviously, specifically looking at what federalism is, looking at the three different levels of government. You have the federal, you have provincial, and you have local municipal, and they different. And, in what they do as well as in what they're allowed to do. We're now going to look specifically at, kind of a little summary then of what I've discussed so far. Let's now look at comparing these three sectors. So these next slides is looking at tables, and I'm specifically kind of summarizing all that we've talked about looking at organization, administration, and finance. So obviously the mission of the three sectors is different. In the private sector, it's to make profit. In the not-for-profit sector, it's to meet community needs, specifically needs that are not served by the public or private sectors. Whereas in the public sector, the mission is to meet the needs of the constituents and more to, address the community as a whole. So who they serve? Well, in the private sector, they can serve whoever they want. Their target market can be whoever they want. But generally, they do this based on market research, because the point is to make money, not just decide who they just want to do something because you want to own a business. The non-for-profit, they're serving members and people in need who maybe can't afford their services. And in the public, they're serving everyone. In terms of revenue, they all generate revenue differently. The private sector, obviously, it's the fees and price charged for the goods and services. And in one of our previous units, we've talked about pricing. Obviously, you can differentiate that. At the not-for-profit sector, they might have membership. They could have donations, fundraising, or grants as other sources of revenue. And one thing I forgot to add on here is they could also have, be charging private sector fees for some programs and services to help offset the costs for, others. And obviously, public sector looks at taxes. And there's different, even philosophies or laws of how that can even be used. Donations and investors. Well, in the private sector, they're seeking capital investments, and they have to repay these investors and lenders. In the not-for-profit sector, they don't have to repay anyone. They're donors, it's a donation given. And in the public sector, usually you don't have donations, but sometimes you do if sometimes there might be charitable stuff, or for let's say, for maybe a facility. In terms of taxes, and I mean about financial, about financing, accounting, in the private sector, obviously they pay taxes, including paying taxes on profit. In the non-for-profit sector, they don't pay any taxes. And in the public sector, well, they collect them. They don't pay them. The different fees and pricing structures differ between the three sectors. In the private sector, they charge fees at a profit, and it's how they determine that is what the economic and target market, can bear. What's going on? The not-for-profit sector, they might be free or very low cost, or they might charge competitive fees but waive them for people who are low income. And the public sector basically charges reasonable fees or no fees at all, simply usually to cover costs like operating costs and that sort of thing, program costs. Transparency differs. So in the private sector, they don't have to be transparent about their finances unless they have shareholders and investors. Then they have to show them. In the nonprofit sector, you have some transparency, to government in reporting, but you might also have membership reports, annual general meetings. And so they have to provide a reasonable level of financial transparency to donors too. What is this donation being used for? And finally, in the public sector, obviously transparency is very, very high. And finally, governance is different between the three sectors. In the private sector, it could be an owner, like a sole proprietor, with or without employees. Or it could range like, a multi-million-dollar company, board of directors, shareholders gone public. At the not-for-profit sector, there is, the person who does the day-to-day work is the executive director. And the executive director sits on the board of directors and the board of directors oversees the director and the organization. And finally, at the public sector, governance is different depending on whether it's local, provincial, or the federal government system. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of the three sectors and how they compare in terms of their structure and particularly their finance. On the exam, really, that compare and contrast slides are important here because you really need to understand the differences between the three sectors.